Welcome back to DemystifySci. I'm Anastasia,
I'm Shiloh.
and this is the podcast where we search for the theories that are going to change the world. Something that we've talked about a lot on this show is the currently very, very popular idea that the universe is headed towards an eventual heat death, where everything collapses into basically nothingness. And we've always thought that this is kind of a weird theory to have at the center of the world because it kind of creates the sense that none of this matters. Like, why bother doing anything in the world if what it aims for is the eventual destruction of the entire cosmos? And so today we're exploring one of the ways in which this has become an extraordinarily powerful idea, and that is through the lens of entropy. We've never talked about entropy directly on the podcast. And with us for the conversation, we have Howard Bloom, who is an author of, I think, 7 or 8 books that have all been centered around this question of how to make sense of the cosmos through a human lens. And he began his career in kind of an unconventional place. He got interested in science as a young kid, and then actually ended up being one of the most powerful PR guys in the music industry. But he treats himself as being kind of an anthropologist along the lines of Margaret Mead, somebody who went into this world in order to understand the human mind, the human drive, and the way that ideas fit together. And after he came out of this world, he started to realize that the scientific concept of entropy, this idea that all that we focus on is the waste products of a system, because that is the eventual point that the entire universe is driving towards, is actually creating an incredibly toxic and disempowering cosmology, where instead of focusing on the human project in the sense of what we should be doing and the things that we should be trying to achieve, we're instead focusing exclusively on the decay and the waste and the destruction.
Yeah. So this is actually a pretty rough start of a conversation because Howard starts off discussing the Big Bang. And if you've been around the podcast for any length of time, you probably know that we haven't really been sold on this idea that the universe hatched out of nothing into something. And so it takes us a little while to kind of see what he's driving towards. And I think that it will really all add up to something if you stick it out for this kind of difficult and painful process of gripping and of wrestling with the idea of nonsensical things in science and how those often form the bedrock for new ideas that come out of them, and what it looks like for ideas to rupture in science, and what it looks like for us to try to overly extend our theories to things. Because ultimately, this is a discussion about how entropy has been a tool developed by people back in the 1800s to make steam engines, and then over applied to the universe at large to draw insane conclusions like this is all headed towards an apocalyptic heat death thing. And so it fits right in line with our exploration of how science and a spiritually healthy society should overlap, and where they touch base and where they don't. And honestly, Howard's story of how he transformed all of these different artists over the course of his career by getting them to actually look inward is a radical story that I think we can all bring to whatever it is that we're trying to do in the world. And it's really powerful because he had incredible success with all of these artists. I mean, his roster is unbelievable. And it's really just been a joy to listen to him tell these stories about how he found a way to tie all of the things he learned over the course of this really wild and wide-ranging career into a bundle around this concept of entropy.
Something that we talk about with Howard is the dubious nature of sponsorships. And he makes this case that when he had artists that were wildly popular and corporations came to them and they were like, hey, will you pitch ketchup for us? Will you let us use your music in order to sell people on the dream that Heinz offers the French fry eating public? That it was the worst possible thing that they could do. And we also happen to be big believers in that. We're producing something that is a public good. We're exploring ideas like nobody else in the world is exploring right now. And we genuinely believe that the only way that we can keep doing this and stay true to the mission is by being supported by our audience. What that means is that every single week we ask you to come to patreon.com/demystifysci and sign up to give us just 75 cents a week. I know it's trying economic times. I know that it is an uncertain world out there. But we really, really, truly believe that the only way that this project will survive is if it is supported by the people who listen to it. And if you do support us, you will seed the ground for this becoming far more than a podcast. Because right now, what we do is we sit literally in our living room. I am looking at our kitchen and our dining room table right now, and we talk to people over Zoom. But over the course of the last year, we've actually had the great fortune of being able to talk to people in person. And we have seen the power of those conversations. We can get deeper with people faster if we are in person with them. And one of the biggest aims of our Patreon is to get enough funds to actually be able to record these conversations in person. But that's not everything. We also want to be able to make this a community that is not just through the internet, asynchronous, where everybody listens to the podcast alone and then goes back to their lives and wonders, man, what would it be like if I could surround myself with people that were actually interested in the same ideas that I'm interested in? And so if you support us on Patreon, what that means is that we actually have the funds to be able to produce regular live events. Our goal is to be able to have a live event every quarter, and that probably includes an official conference like the one that we already had twice, once in Austin, once in Sesimbra, Portugal. It includes being able to do Paradigm Drift live instead of doing it through Zoom meetings, and probably a couple of other events that we're dreaming of. I would love to be able to take groups backpacking. We would love to be able to have like a big camp out every year where we just gather people and let the audience provide the programming, where it's like everyone can sign up to give an hour-long session if they want. And so I know that it is hard to part with your hard-earned cash. But if you do support us, I promise that we will do something magnificent and we will do something beautiful for the world. And you also get to meet with us every single week. You get to meet with all of the awesome patrons that we have. And so I really, really hope that you'll come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci and help us grow this podcast into something that is far more than just an internet talk show.
Absolutely. I almost don't want to follow that, but you should also consider signing up for Paradigm Shift, where you can also share your ideas with the world. And it's a cool new segment we're doing. By the time this goes out, we will have just recorded our 6th Paradigm Drift. You should sign up for the next one. We don't have a date for it yet, but we will be putting out that announcement very soon. So check it out and see if you have something to offer with that project.
And without further ado, enjoy our conversation with Howard Bloom about the questionable utility of entropy as a founding principle of the universe and what it means to actually build a progressive cosmos.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
Why is entropy important? Why should we care about entropy?
Entropy is profoundly important because it shapes the way we regard the entire universe in which we live, from the Big Bang to what you and I are doing right now. And it is a fundamental error. It is an error of such pernicious evil in science that it defies belief, because it misleads scientists about the nature of the universe they live in and keeps them blind to many of the real problems that we need to figure out. I mean, this universe is the most creative thing we've ever seen in our lives. Well, frankly, it's the only thing we've ever seen in our lives. But it is brilliantly fecund. You know, it just blossoms more than 1 million gardens. It does that constantly. And you cannot see that straight or begin to explain its mysteries if you decide to define everything as neg-entropy, as a double negative. The human brain cannot deal with double negatives, and it's a way of tangling scientists in a form of thought and speech that wastes their energies, wastes their brilliance, and slows them down, and produces, of all things, in the sciences, entropy.
What's your picture of the standard conception of entropy?
The standard conception of entropy, do you want me to tell you the history of it? Because that gives a much better sense of
Sure.
what it is.
Let's
Yeah,
do it.
let's go.
So in 1850, there was a relatively new technology. It was actually about a 60-year-old technology that was changing lives in Britain, which monopolized this technology outrageously. It had increased the income of the standard British worker by approximately 70%. And everybody wanted to know about it. And in science, there was an obsession with this new technology. It was called the steam engine. And it was big in 1850 to try to work out the theoretical aspects of the steam engine, not the real steam engine, but the steam engine as if it were a machine that Archimedes was describing. Everybody wanted to be the new Archimedes. And so there were two big hypotheses that a few rebels were coming up with in the 1850s. They were that Lavoisier, the father of chemistry in the 1770s, had said that heat, which is basic to steam engines, that heat was a particle. And these new guys, 70 years later, were coming up with the idea, and this is a weird idea, so brace yourself, that heat was the movement of particles. It was the movement of these things called atoms and molecules that nobody had ever proven the existence of, and that many people in science did not believe in. They thought it was an illusion. So this was a radical idea. And William Thomson wrote a piece. William Thomson was at the University of Glasgow, and his father had been a professor. He was a professor of natural science. And he came up with, he observed that in any steam engine, 80% of its energy is lost to friction. And in that same paper, 1850, on mechanical dissipation of heat, he said that everything runs down the way a steam engine will run down. Everything turns, and you have useful steam pushing the piston in a steam engine, and 80% is lost and goes into exhaust. And exhaust is random. It's useless, at least as it was regarded then. And he extended this to the whole world. And he said the entire world is subject to the mechanical dissipation of energy, of heat. And as a consequence, this was the last line of his paper. As a consequence, he made a prediction. Predictions are very important in science, because in science, if your predictions hold up, that supports your theory. If your predictions go utterly false, that falsifies your theory. It means your theory is wrong. And so he predicted that the entire world was at one time uninhabitable by animals, plants, and man, and eventually will once again be uninhabitable by animals, plants, and men, all because of the mechanical dissipation of heat. 2 years later, a colleague of his at the University of Glasgow, John McCorn Rankine, called what William Thomson was proposing and predicting heat death. And heat death has been with us ever since. Meanwhile, William Thomson was batting papers back and forth with a graduate student in Germany named Rudolf Clausius. And it took Rudolf Clausius a lot of thinking, but eventually he came up with a name for this idea that everything eventually turns into a useless exhaust, like the exhaust of a steam engine. And he called it entropy. And 10 years later, after 10 years of thinking, he came up with what he called the two basic theorems of entropy. And the second theorem is entropy in the universe is on a constant increase. So remember, these guys are making predictions about the world, William Thomson, and the universe, Rudolf Clausius. So if their predictions don't hold up, their theory is shot. About 10 years later, a guy named Ludwig Boltzmann came up with a mathematical explanation for entropy. And he said that there are gazillions of possible states of things. And eventually, in the end, things that are in an improbable state, like the three of us, will go through the process that the steam in a steam engine goes through, of becoming utterly useless and totally random and chaotic. And there are gazillion ways that things could be totally random and chaotic. There are almost no ways that things could have form and give birth to other things that in turn create more form. So that was entropy. That was the package of entropy. And these days, when I talk to people at some of the journals that I've written for, they say, "Oh, you can't use the universe to disprove entropy because it was designed for atoms and molecules. So unless you talk about atoms and molecules, you're not really talking about entropy." If you'll excuse the expression, that's utter bullshit. Because the universe has gone from a nothing to a Big Bang. That's the opposite of entropy.
Well,
yeah, I'm not so sure about that.
It's one. What's that? I know you disagree with the Big Bang, but
I don't even know if I disagree with it. I'm just I haven't been convinced.
Okay, so the big deal is if your predictions are wrong, your theory is almost certainly wrong. And remember, these guys, William Thomson, who would later be named Lord Kelvin, and Rudolf Clausius and Ludwig Boltzmann, they were involved in making specific predictions about Die Welt, is the way it was put. Those are the words that Clausius used in his second law of thermodynamics. Entropy in Die Welt, which either means the world or the universe, is on a constant increase. So I know that that you have done a lot of research on things that would obviate the idea of the Big Bang, but let's just go with the Big Bang as a starting point for the story, because the story of the universe is that we started with a nothing, we ended up with a something infinitely smaller than a pinprick that contained within it implicitly an entire universe. That's impossible. And
do you believe this story?
Yes.
Why?
I've spent my whole life in it. So I know you're skeptical about it. But one way or the other...
Well, you just said, like, at the beginning of the story, you were like, this thing came out of nothing, and that's impossible.
I have a theory about that, but that's not that's a story for another time. So this story sounds utterly preposterous to you?
Yes, specifically because so I think that there's a couple of different things here. The first is that I think you can tell this story without relying on the Big Bang.
Okay.
Because the apparent ordering of the universe is pretty obvious.
Right.
And so even if you start the story when atoms already exist,
right,
the particulars are still the same. Like, we don't see a universe that appears to be, edging towards a uniform heat death where there's nothing in it.
Right, exactly.
What we see a universe that's full of progressively more and more complex structures,
right,
that there's order in one place, that as that starts to fall apart, that feeds order in another place, and it doesn't seem to be the same kind of closed system as like a heat engine that has waste heat, and because of the fact that you've bordered your model at the exhaust pipe of the waste heat, you're like, well, it's just disorder and it dissipates, and that's kind of the end of that story. Like,
right.
I think that the problem with bringing in the Big Bang, especially for us, is that it's a story that requires so many caveats and so many, well, there is this impossible moment, but don't worry about this impossible moment. And I'm like, I don't think that it makes sense to try to tell a clearer story about a scientific concept like entropy and start with something like the Big Bang, where you yourself have to include these caveats of like, well, it doesn't totally make sense.
Right.
And so it's like, I think that we can leave that aside, because imagine that there was no Big Bang. Imagine that we live in a universe that is relatively eternal.
Right.
Yes, you have the philosophical question of why is there something rather than nothing, but answering that question by saying, well, there was a time that there was nothing, and then the nothing became something, doesn't really fix your problem, because then you have this philosophical dualism where you're like, well, how does nothing become something? And you're just off on this path. So, okay, like, let's just say that that realm of phenomena of something from nothing, or the question of why the universe is versus it isn't, is beyond the scope of the question of, is the universe going to be subject to an eventual heat death?
Right. Well, you put this very well when you said that we do not have the uniform mist of useless energy that William Thomson predicted. Instead, we have the opposite. We have quarks gathering into atoms, an utterly surprising new level of property. We have atoms, or we have particles gathering together and forming atoms, which is an utterly surprising property. We have atoms gathering gravitationally in these great, big, giant, swirling dust clouds that then precipitate into stars, planets, and moons. Every one of these steps that I've just described is the opposite of what William Thomson predicted. And it's the opposite of what William Boltzmann said. Remember, William Boltzmann said there are a million ways to be random, and a very tiny number of ways to be a star, a planet, a moon, or you and me. And he was right in his own way, but the universe does not operate according to the probability theory of Ludwig Boltzmann. Not at all. In this universe, the most improbable thing happens. The most improbable things are always, there's another set of improbable things right around the corner. And the image that captures this is, imagine that you put your slinky at the top of a staircase and watch it crawl all the way down, step after step after step. Now, do it again, take a picture of it with your iPhone, take a video of it, run that video in reverse. So, according to the entropists, the universe operates like the slinky at the top of a staircase, constantly descending into formlessness. But in fact, the universe operates like the slinky in reverse, climbing the staircase, finding new levels of existence, new levels of properties that didn't exist before, over and over and over again. And just in your lifetime and mine, we humans have pulled this off.
Oh, so
Lots of times.
there's actually a really interesting thing here, which is, so do you know, I think it's William Prout had a theory that all atoms in existence are actually permutations of hydrogens.
Permutations of what?
Of hydrogen atoms. So,
Assemblies.
Hydrogen. Well,
wait,
yes,
what's
this goes back to
They're
steady
like
state theory.
assemblies. All the atoms are built out of hydrogen.
Yeah, exactly. And so, as you say that, okay, so the universe is progressively becoming more and more complicated and producing these like grander and grander structures. There's also this other piece of it, which is that we do have a periodic table, and the periodic table is relatively limited. Right? So there's like, I don't know, like, I don't actually know how many atoms, like a couple hundred atoms.
There are 98 natural, and I think at this point 105, including the ones we've made in the lab.
But it's a limited stack of objects that has like a theoretical barrier to it. Do you think that that's significant somehow, where it's like there's a limit to the sort of atomic complexity that can be produced, which is then the sort of the building blocks for all other things? Like, if the universe was drifting towards permanent increased complexity, would you not expect that you would have like infinite numbers of types of atoms in it?
You certainly would. That is the current theory, that the probability theory is the major form of mathematics being used to discuss these things. And probability theory's predictions do not pan out at all. Instead, I mean, remember, when the first stars died, if this were a Lord Kelvin universe, if this were a heat death universe, their material would have dispersed randomly. But it didn't. The stars at their heart produce such enormous gravity that they jammed the nuclei of hydrogen, helium, and lithium together. They jammed them together so hard that they were stuck to each other. And that gave birth to the 98 natural forms of matter, which had not existed in this universe before. It was the slinky climbing one more stair step up the ladder of complexity, or in my terminology, flamboyance, because I suggest replacing the second law of thermodynamics with the first law of flamboyance, that this universe is constantly increasing its level. Complexity, I don't think does justice to
Well,
what
it's weird because
happens.
it does make really ordered, structured things, but it also makes a lot of chaos,
Yep.
right? And so it's really a quantitative argument at the end of the day. Like, people. There's been Nobel Prizes award. Like Prigozhin got a Nobel Prize for basically
For
saying
bullshit. He got a Nobel Prize for bullshit.
for
He
basically
stepped out and said that he was going to give us a post-Newtonian view of the world, and instead he gave us neg entropy, which is a nonsense. It is, again, a double negative. Entropy is a negative, and so is non. So this
isn't he
isn't,
just
you and I
saying
are
that?
not neg entropy. You and I are flamboyant, extraordinary, beyond belief complexity. And Ludwig Goldson says that the three of us don't exist or shouldn't exist.
I think Prigozhin is just saying that where things are dissipating across an energy gradient, basically you have all this motion, and there's going to be interesting traffic jams along the way that create structured configurations, which
Something like that, but I think
are still they're still in the minority compared to all the chaos that's going on they're still in the minority compared to all of the microstates that are being explored external to those structures. So it's really just like a quantitative comparison of ordered microstates versus disordered microstates. And as long as on balance in this energy flow, you still have a tendency towards more of the disordered microstates, then the dissipative structures pay for themselves.
Well, as Anastasia just said, this is looking at the exhaust and imagining that the exhaust explains the steam engine.
It's part of the story, right? Like you can't have a steam engine without exhaust.
No, it's part of the steam engine story, yes. Is it part of the story of the universe? No, the universe takes this random stuff that should be random and it organizes it in giant clouds of gas and dust. And those giant clouds of gas and dust generate stars and moons and planets. It's stepping up every step of the way. And if you try to concentrate on what gets left out, on any chaos that's created, I don't see chaos being created on the whole.
I mean, to make those stars and planets and stuff, you might have to burn a lot of shit to get it to happen, right? Like,
right.
I mean, depending on your theory of planetary formation and moons and all that, we could just stick with stars. But I mean, there's a lot of destruction, and like even just look at the solar wind. You can essentially see this. It's pretty apparent if you have the right instruments. And there's a ton of just really chaotic particulate matter flying off of the sun, exploring all sorts of microstates.
Well, and look at light. That is an exhaust.
All sorts of different light, right?
Right. And light was poisonous to life, and yet life took hold and thrived and eventually learned how to harness light. So this universe takes things that might be useless, that should be, in the theory of entropy, useless, and finds uses for them.
But I think Prigozhin would agree with that. I think that's why he got his Nobel Prize, as far as I can tell.
Well, I was bitterly disappointed by his book in 1988 when it first came out.
Why were you so disappointed by it?
Because he promised me a post-Newtonian science, and he gave me an 1865 science. He gave me entropy.
To be fair, that is post-Newtonian.
Yes, it's post-Newtonian, but it's still a bitter disappointment to me because I'm always looking for I'm like you. I'm always looking for new ideas, new ways to look at things, new ways to make sense of things. And my books, I try to write new ways of looking at things so that kids who come after me have new lenses with which to see the world around them. And I write because when I was 10 years old, I was a lost kid. And my parents didn't want to have anything to do with me, and other kids didn't want to have anything to do with me. And one day there appeared in my lap a book, and it said the first two laws of science are these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And it gave the story of Galileo. It told it wrong, but I needed to hear it in the heroic version. And number two, look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. Look at things that you and everybody else around you take for granted, and look at those things. Pick them out and turn them into questions. And it gave the example of Anton von Leeuwenhoek. And that book saved my life. So my goal with my books is to save the life of some kid 350 years down the road, the way that Galileo and Anton von Leeuwenhoek saved mine. And that is if you want to use Prigogéne's terminology, it's definitely an anti-entropic process. That is contributing to a growth process. If I succeed and my ideas and books last, God knows what new forms they will take. And those forms could be as life-shattering and universe-shattering as the invention of the iPhone in 2007.
I mean, I do think that there's a really interesting question here that physics hasn't really been able to answer, which is like what is the organizing principle of the universe that succeeds in producing complex structures rather than just some momentary state where there is complexity that then decays into nothingness. And I guess that the heat death version of the universe says that we do live in a momentary state, right? It's trying to say that there is this momentary era of the history of the universe where there are interesting things happening, and at some point the interesting things will stop happening.
And I believe that they will never stop. And you made a brilliant formulation that we need a law that explains how you go from one state of matter to a more complex state of matter. I mean, we are incredibly complex states of matter, and describing us as states of matter even is an utterly it's an oversimplification that blinds us to what's really in front of us.
Yeah, the heat death mythos is utterly bankrupt. So you're not going to get any disagreement from me on that.
And that wasn't the only. I mean, these guys, William Thomson, Rudolf Clausius, they came up with a name for themselves or for what they were doing, thermodynamics. And the second theorem of Clausius in 1865 became the second law of thermodynamics. I don't remember where I was going with this, but in my opinion, look, I belong to a couple of, I don't really get time for them, but I belong to a couple of scientific groups that meet online. And they get so trapped in entropy that they say nothing useful. They can produce long letters, and they seem to be competing with each other for who can be the most incomprehensible. Because there's some implicit idea that the more incomprehensible you are, the smarter you are.
Well, that's exactly our problem with the Big Bang and with most of quantum physics, right? Is that like we're inheriting a scientific landscape right now where it's exactly as you say. The more incomprehensible that you are, the more valued your ideas are, the more impenetrable and in some ways like irrational your ideas are, the more that you have to tell somebody, look, I know you don't understand this.
Yes,
there's really not that many people in the entire universe that do, but if you really study super hard and you learn the super advanced form of mathematics where you inherit the centuries of analytical training, then maybe you can begin to even scratch the surface. And I think that is a really common problem in the sciences right now.
You've
so it's
got
funny
it perfectly. That is so perfect. It's really ridiculous. Do you know the word hieratic?
No.
Hieratic means the language of the priests.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we're going to start using that one a lot.
And to get into the priesthood, you have to go through all kinds of backflips, all kinds of rituals, until you will finally get to the point where, to quote, I think it was the Red Queen, the White Queen, in Alice in Wonderland, sometimes I think 6 impossible things before breakfast. You're measured by the number of impossible things you can believe before breakfast. And if you get enough of them, your description was so brilliant, it's amazing. Then maybe we'll let you into the club of science. well, then it's not science. I'm sorry. Once you have a shibboleth, once you have an impossible belief you have to swear allegiance to, or else, it's not science. Science is about examining everything right under your nose and questioning it.
I could not have said it better myself. What were you going to say, Shiloh?
I mean, I still want to deal with what's problematic about this Prigogine, Stuart Kaufman, Sagan Schneider view that, life, something that's incredibly ordered and complex and nuanced and has this very complex structure to it. It does seem to pay its way by destroying its local environment. Like if you have some food in the fridge and you don't have an airtight seal on it, the food will decompose faster than anything if you get some bugs in there, basically, right? If you get some mold or some,
I thought I cleaned all the bugs out of the fridge.
you never get them all. But yeah, like life does an incredible job of tearing things apart. I think people who have like little children know this too, or like we have a cat and it's like, nothing else can add entropy to my living room like the cat. Like,
I remember when we were substitute teaching, you would, at the end of the day, the entire room would just be covered with flecks of paper. Like the kids would show, and they would literally just...
Yeah, it seems like this law of maximum entropy production kind of makes sense if you think about life as these little externalizing entities that just tear up the environment faster than anything else, which makes them energetically favorable, even under standard 1800s thermodynamics.
Okay, so hold on. I have a question. So the question is this. If you have a system that is highly ordered and produces a lot of disorder, like, say, a steam engine, the steam engine is something that is produced by the hand of man.
Right.
You're stuck when you're dealing with something like life by asking the question of, like, how does it come to be in the first place that you have such a complex crystallized system if at every stage entropy wants to take over and dissipate the structure into nothingness? I think
I guess
that's...
Prigogine's answer is that its channeling of that chaos pays for itself. Like it actually maximizes the dissipation by forming narrow structures. Like the narrow structures maximize the production of entropy fundamentally.
But the narrow structures, this is again, to quote you, this is defining everything in terms of its exhaust. And as a consequence, taking your eye off the ball. There are three of us right now. We are sitting talking using electronic means that didn't exist 15 years ago. And every single one of us, all three of us, we all started as a single egg. How does a single egg construct the miracle of the three of us, of each of us? How does that happen? Now, Stuart Kaufman's beginning to look at this, but he's trying to look at it because he's in one of the groups I belong to. And he's trying to look at this in terms of entropy. No, you're looking at the wrong thing. First, try to explain how the steam engine works. Then you can fiddle with the exhaust and see how trivial the exhaust is compared to the construction, the invention of the steam engine. The steam engine changed the world.
So is the fundamental question, like, why does the universe produce something as complex as life?
It's not as complex. Why does, I don't know how the word for it except for flamboyance. How does the universe produce things as ornate, as extraordinary, as defying norms as the three of us? How does it produce things that are constantly kicking against us and kicking it up that staircase toward the next stair step up? How does it do that?
I mean, I think that is a really interesting question. I don't have the answer to it. I mean, so this is actually funny because Shiloh and I have had this argument many, many times where I have over the years gradually softened to his position, where it's like, okay, so if you have an eternal universe, then the processes and the features of it must also be eternal functionally. And so, like, you can have a universe that is finite and has a beginning, and in that universe, life also must have a beginning.
Right.
But if you have an eternal universe, it is in some ways possible that life is a phenomenon that just eternally arises at some minimal state, and when the conditions around it are sufficiently nurturing that it can continue to grow to the complexity that we see in front of us. Like, if
Right.
you treat life in its simplest form as being not that different from, say, a hurricane, like
Right.
it's irrational to ask, like, when was the first hurricane? Because there's like planets with atmospheres and temperature gradients and oceans, and so like there's probably always been some form of vorticular motion
Right.
that
And
is
look at
produced.
a galaxy, which most of which eventually settle into that same pattern that powers the hurricane. I
Exactly.
call these patterns.
And
Patterns
so
that are
like
so basic that
and
they appear on level after level of emergence in the universe.
okay, so is life one of those patterns that just only becomes as ornate as we see it today in some specific places that are more hospitable than others? Or do you think that it's
We
discrete?
don't know the answer because, in theory, yes, life should be all over the place. We should be discovering it on exoplanets all over the place. But in fact, we've had, despite how many years has SETI been in existence, looking for life? 50 years. I talked to Carl Sagan when he first was putting it together, and we can't find evidence of life. We're finding DMS, dimethyl sulfide, right now. And the line of thinking is that dimethyl sulfide is only created by life. So if we see dimethyl sulfide on an exoplanet, that is a sign that it may have life. And in fact, we have seen dimethyl sulfide, and the original observations have been confirmed by subsequent observations. And if we are right that it's only produced by life, it may be a sign of life. But so far, in fact, we have not found life anywhere else, which is weird. Because once the universe invents stars, there are stars all over the place. Once the universe invents atoms, there are atoms all over the place. The universe tends to create something new, generate something new, and that something new shows up all over the face of the cosmos. And life should follow that basic rule.
To some degree.
Yeah, like there's only one spiral in the galaxy. Like it might be that there's only one life in a galaxy. Like you just don't know the scale. I mean, this place is enormous, and we don't know how rare life is. We don't know if it's just a feature that it takes the entire thing for it to occur, if it's a collaboration of the entire system and how big that system is.
Right.
And I'm like, I think that stars are also, and this may be heretical, but I feel like they're fairly simple structures. Like they have a relative.
Compared to a bacteria, yeah, in terms of like compartments and stuff, right?
And your
That's-
refrigerator, stuff doesn't deteriorate in your refrigerator. It transforms in your refrigerator to yet more life. It's the bacteria that are breaking down the things in your refrigerator. They, as you just said, are highly complex, astonishing systems. Just amazing systems. And it's the yeast, which is also amazing stuff. So life is not going through a process of deterioration. It's going through a process of transformation constantly. And how that occurs, I mean, look, nature invented death. That's the ultimate form of consumerism and waste. And yet nature invented it. Nature invented pain.
Wait, unpack that.
Yeah. Well, every living thing that has ever been generated in the 4 billion years or so in which life has existed on this planet has died. I worked out the number of creatures, things that have died on this planet, and it's a number so big that it just defies belief. 99.9% of all the species who have ever lived had died out before there was ever the birth of man. And of course, the bacterium is more complex than it looks because bacteria cannot live on their own. Talk about a bacterium, you're talking about an entire complex society of bacteria, 7 billion, that are communicating wildly and exploring to see where there's a new food resource and getting frightened and consolidating. frightened is an anthropomorphic term, but one way
But
or the other.
you said something about the invention of death was the most consumerist action ever invented.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Takes vast amounts of matter, so it's very materialist. It puts them together in astonishing ways. The astonishment, again, of the three of us, each of us starting from a single cell. Just
technically, we started from 2 cells.
What's that?
I said technically we all started from 2 cells.
Well, but they merged.
That's true. That's true. But you can't make a baby with just an egg.
Right.
I have a really hard time thinking about life without thinking about its surroundings. Like, it's very difficult for me to see myself existing without the trees outside.
Yeah.
Right. Like, this is why you get into this ecosystems thinking. And honestly, like, system is the most dirty word in all of science, because you have to put boundaries on some physical landscape in order to even begin to formulate some hypothesis about what's happening. Like, you have to restrict your conversation, otherwise you're talking about everything all at once. And this is the
I
problem.
talk about everything all at once. That's apparently my job on this planet.
Well, you run the risk of talking about nothing if you talk about everything, is the problem. And so when you talk about life and you're looking at it and you're trying to explain how it is that it becomes so magnificent and ordered, it's difficult to understand that, I think, without looking at the surroundings. Like, what happened to all of those gazillions of organisms that have died over the years? Like, they've all turned into dust, right? I mean, they've turned into food for other organisms. They've been broken down
for other organisms. That's what's happening.
That's a tremendous amount of entropy that's paid for their lives along the way. All of that dissipation that's happened in the aftermath, our bodies will all break down eventually one day and become...
They won't break down into randomness. They will not break down into William Thomson's heat death. They will break down into the opposite. They will break down into yet more ordered form, the bacterial colonies.
Some of them, right? But not all of it, right? I mean, the world is teeming with life, but when we look out into the universe, there's not a lot of life on Mars. Like, there's a tremendous surface area of just rock that it doesn't have life, right? It's just dust, it's just junk. And maybe there was life at some point on some of these rocks, but the aftermath certainly points towards a lot of dissipation.
Right. But you would think that that nature would find us less disposable, because each one of us is a product of an incredible, unbelievable process of self-construction. Just unbelievable. And Stuart Kauffman is beginning to come to terms with this aspect of life, that it isn't built like a machine. It's not made of a bunch of parts that are pulled together. It's the opposite. It starts with incredible simplicity, if you want to call a cell simple, and you and I both know it's not. But it starts with single cells, and it builds itself. How do cells manage to produce things so different as the muscles in your arm and the material in your fingernails? As the muscles in your arm and that transparent, hard lens of material in your eye. That's astonishing. How in the world does it pull that off?
It's got to eat a lot of food for starters, and it's got to breathe a lot of air, right? I mean, there's a tremendous amount of...
It's a process of transformation, not of decay.
Transformation, yeah, but I think Prigogine would agree with that. I think any of these entropic argument guys would agree that there's a transformation going on.
Well, the big problem
life kind of inserts itself
William
into
Thomson
the stream.
made this prediction. William Thomson made this prediction about heat death, but that wasn't his only prediction. 6 years after he wrote this paper on the mechanical dissipation of heat, a guy nobody had ever heard of produced a book, 1857, and it was what we know as the evolution of the species. It was Darwin's first book. And William Thomson, who never admitted this, and you won't find it in his biographies, was religious. Later in life, he would become the head of a religious society that was attempting to defeat atheistic arguments.
I'm pretty sure they were all religious at that point.
Darwin went to divinity school.
So yeah, Darwin's wife was religious. And so, at any rate, nonetheless, he got away with writing this book. And William Thomson avoided reading it for the first 3 years, then finally read it and did this. He took the melting temperatures of slate, granite, and a bunch of other stone. He took Fourier's equations, which were his favorite equations for everything. He took new observations of what's under the Earth from the Greenwich Laboratory, which is in London. He put all of this together, and he calculated the age of the Earth. And the age of the Earth, he said, was between 20 million and 400 million years old. And he said that disproved Darwin entirely, because Darwin's gradualist form of evolution depended on far more time than this universe had been around. And he felt he'd disproven Darwinism, and Darwin was deeply pained about this because William Thomson was a highly renowned scientist, and he was a polymath, self-taught for the most part by his research, who had avoided the university path, and by now the university was it in science. And here was one of the leading scientists of the time saying Darwin couldn't possibly be right. It hurt him enormously. Now, was that prediction correct? Was it any more correct than the prediction of heat death in 1850 and 1851? No. No, it wasn't. It was, despite all the complexity and the impossibility of Fourier's equations, it was off by 4 billion years. That is a big missing of the mark. The prediction, once again, of entropy, of the entropy did not come true.
I just said it might be off way more than that. Well, I think Thomson had a lot riding on it. He was also trying to power the sun. Like his mechanism, which was basically a compression engine, like a diesel engine for the sun, also predicted that the sun would burn itself out in a mere 20 million years or something like that. So I think he was not unbiased in his need to have the Earth conform to that timescale.
Right.
But Darwin won. Why did Darwin's timescale win? I mean, a lot of it had to do, from what I understand, with them finding these fossils of these critters up in the mountains and stuff.
And his grandfather had been one of the finders of some of those fossils.
And it just was untenable.
Was also an astonishing man. But so why? What does
this example illustrate?
It illustrates one thing. Go back to the basic idea. In science, if your predictions fail, your theory may be wrong. And if so, multiple predictions failed. In the time of William Thomson himself, he was the one making these predictions. So if your theory, if your predictions fail, it means that your theory may be wrong. Thermodynamics may be wrong.
It seems to me like I think I understand like the crux of the issue here. It seems like you're saying that he overextended his theory to try to universalize some phenomenon, which he didn't have the justification to do, because his thermodynamic equations are fine for little like Carnot engines and things like that, right? Like there is a world, whether it's in an engineering laboratory or elsewhere, where these thermodynamic equations are quite reliable and useful for building steam engines or rocket ships or whatever. I don't know what people do with them.
And for chemistry.
But to universalize them, and this is a mistake we see time and time again in the history of physics, and ultimately this is what led people to the Big Bang in the first place. Like they want to extrapolate their understanding of something that happens on some local scale to everything, because that's the holy grail of a physics theory. Is like it's not just explaining what happened in this laboratory; it explains everything. And like we could just list you like example after example where things that are at the bleeding edge of understanding in modern physics can be traced back to this desire and mistakes that were made in the attempt to universalize things. If this, like, we can talk about Kirchhoff's law, like we can talk about all sorts of examples where Planck's basic, idea of the photon, like these are all attempts to universalize a phenomenon that was observed in one tiny situation. And the scientists were so hopeful that it could be applied to these everywhere all the time that they kind of strong-armed that through. And it was such an attractive persuasive idea, because wouldn't it be nice if everything really did kind of behave the same everywhere? And if we only had to understand like light in one circumstance, and then we could understand all of electromagnetic radiation, that would be really nice. So people just kind of roll with it along the way, and they bash these equations around until they conform to this idea. But then they end up with nonsense oftentimes in various particular paradoxical situations, and they scratch their heads like, why doesn't this make sense?
Right.
And nobody's going back to the foundations, which is why like we had such a hard time at the beginning of this conversation, because the foundations are everything. Like if you assume that the universe came from nothing, then like why not? A heat death may as well be a good explanation, because like the foundation is preposterous in the first place. Like in science, we don't just say, well, the impossible happened. Like we don't accept that no matter what. And so if we start with a crazy idea, then when we process it and try to universalize it and make sense of where it's going to end up later, then it's also going to be nonsense on top of
Right.
it. So
Well, I think that's a brilliant summation. That a lot of this comes from the scientific community developing something. You know, science is really all about battle between subcultures. And some cultures, for example, some subcultures say that the pumps in the walls of cells, especially neurons, are active pumps. And some people used to say that they're passive pumps. And a lot of debate gets thrown around. But when you try to universalize these things and say the whole universe works this way, well, that's a wonderful hypothesis. That's a great guess. I mean, we have to tackle these big questions. We're built to tackle these big questions. But if your prediction fails over and over again, then put things back on the scale in which they belong. Say, yes, entropy works in a chemical laboratory. Entropy works when you're building heat engines. But it doesn't describe the universe. In fact, it distracts us from the nature of the universe. I have been part of a group for a long time called the Foundations of Information Science. And that's a group where Stuart Kaufman shows up. These guys, I mean, once upon a time, these guys have a bizarre obsession. And to understand it, you got to tell a story. Once upon a time, Claude Shannon was working for Bell Labs, and he was trying to figure out how to get the maximum number of phone calls into a copper wire that would go all the way across the country. And he used mathematics to try to figure it out. And he grabbed the equation for entropy, H equals, and he applied it, and guess what? It allowed him to pack more phone calls into a copper wire. And he had a friend and he asked the friend, what should I call this principle I've come up with using this equation of entropy? And his friend said, call it information theory. That was one of the most insidious things that ever happened to that equation, because it was not an equation about information at all. Information, at least according to one of my books, according to what I've written, information is anything that a receiver can understand. And how do you measure whether a receiver has understood something? It's action after it's absorbed this message. And without that understanding of the message, there's no such thing as information. For example, starlight hit the Earth for over 4 billion years before mankind arrived. Up until then, it was not information, because the Earth was just absorbing it and doing nothing about it. It wasn't affecting anything. And then humans came along and started reading the stars and creating calendars and creating astrology. All of a sudden, that starlight, which was a nothing, became one of the most informationally rich forms of what humans regarded as signals, information, you'd ever seen.
rich with disinformation, it turns out, too.
Yes, rich with, but they were
go.
trying, and they were trying to do something impossible. They were trying to predict when the cattle in your land would all die of a plague by using the stars. And there is no causal connection whatsoever. But at least they were trying. They were making the effort to make sense of things. And in the process, they turned all kinds of things into information. I mean, look at mud. Mud was poisonous. If you've ever lived in the Middle East in the rainy season out on a farm, you sink up to your knees in the mud. You are in danger of being entrapped in that mud and dying there and becoming another bogman. And somebody, roughly 11 million years ago, came up with a bizarre idea. Take that mud and pat it into a shape of a kind no human had ever really seen before. That is a rectangular shape. A shape that to us is normal, but no, it was radically abnormal. Nothing like it had ever been done. Then dry it in the sun. Sell enough of the people around you on this idea that you would make 3 million of these things. Then pile them up in such a way that you make the first garden apartments, the first 3-room apartments. That's a radical, radical change.
You said 11 million years ago, though. It was probably
this was approximately 9 million BC. No, I'm sorry. Yes, you get my zeros wrong all the time. I'm sorry.
9,000.
9,000.
Okay, I was like, there's a piece of history I don't know.
Thank you for catching that. So, at any rate, and they built the town.
Yeah, I don't know that mud bricks would survive for 9 million years, but
well, they have not 9 million, 9,000.
Yeah.
Sorry for my fritzy brain, but
hold on. So this we've left the Claude Shannon information in the wires theory, where it's like I take your point that information is a thing that has to do with utility. And so if there's a bacterium on the Earth that is able to somehow sense starlight to cause it to do something, then there's some sort of information transfer. But as long as it's just beaming down onto the surface of the Earth and there's no one to consider it, there's nothing that is attempting to tell a story about it, no information.
Right. Whereas gravity, we do know that the planets respond to gravity, that gravity is an information source. Because their rotation around the sun is determined by a gravitational force they feel coming from the sun, and they interpret it in motion.
Interesting. So you're basically drawing this line between like reaction to some sort of input, where as long as you have reaction to the input, then you have information, and it can be with something inanimate like a planet.
Right.
But it can't be information until there is some sort of effect.
Yeah.
Okay, and so, but presumably telephone calls inside of a wire are loaded with information. It's not just static that's being transmitted.
No, they're loaded with information once they get to the other end, where there's a phone to pick them up, turn them into an audio signal, and a brain with ears to listen to that audio signal.
Sure, but there's also somebody who's encoding it on the first end, and so once they're making all of the vibrations with their vocal cords, and that's being encoded and it's being stored and transmitted, like, why is it not fair to call what happens in that wire the transmission of information?
It is the transmission of information in a wire for Bell Telephone, because of the humans on the ends. But Claude Shannon was regarding only the signal, if you want to call it that, in the wire. He was only looking at what was going on in the wire. And so in my Foundations of Information Science group, they are obsessed with entropy. And so 80 to 90% of their discussion is in terms of entropy. And it means they are wasting these are smart people. These are very well educated people. And they are wasting their time in arguing about entropy instead of information, something that somebody on one end makes and a receiver on the other end receives and interprets. No, they don't talk about that at all. The group is misnamed. It shouldn't be the Foundations of Information Science. It should be the entropic nonsense of information science.
So what are they trying to figure out by focusing on entropy?
They're trying what you described so brilliantly before. They're trying to show who can be the most incomprehensible and thus the smartest.
It sounds like they're just using an outdated system to try to untangle new. Like, you see this happen all the time. People use the technology to describe the natural world. the technology that is status quo, state of the art in their day. And you see this today in neuroscience. Like everybody talks about neurons doing computation, right? They've got it mixed up now where they talk about the AI as these neural networks. Like that's how entwined the state of the art technology is with the way that we describe nature. Like it's very difficult for us to conceive of nature in any other way than by analogy to the technology that we're designing.
Well, this is because of a miracle, basically. It's because when we invent something new, it gives us not only, like, for example, herding sheep. Brand new idea in a world where sheep have always gone off on their own. And it not only gives us what we get from sheep, wool, meat, and milk, it gives us a new metaphor. And then we start using that metaphor all over the place. So in the Bible, there are two creation stories. One creation story is God took mud and fashioned Adam and Eve. Well, guess what? That's the hot new technology of the time. Turning mud not just into bricks, but turning mud into pottery. These are radical transformations. These are as transformational as the invention of the computer. And then the distillation of the computer down to the laptop I'm using, and the equipment that you're using. So once we get these new technologies, we automatically get a new set of metaphors, and we start applying them all over the place. So, God created man out of mud because pottery was the hot new thing of the time, the hot new technology.
Yeah, so you're like this entropy metaphor with these steam engines is just out of touch with the times.
Yes, totally, completely. I totally agree. And so I propose the first, instead of the second law of thermodynamics, the first law of flamboyance, which is that the universe is constantly like a slinky going in reverse, climbing up to the next invisible stair step of the impossible and making that impossible ordinary. And we don't know where that stair step is as we're climbing toward it. And you and I are contributing to the climb. Right now, while we are talking, we are trying to put things into words, some of which have not been put into words before, and thus giving a new possible reality for the kids who come after us, so that they don't work on the exhaust. They try to explain the steam engine and see if it has any relevance to the rest of the cosmos, and if it doesn't, to go beyond it and look for the next metaphor that will explain things. And metaphors work, according to my book, The God Problem. Metaphors work by finding patterns. And patterns are patterns that recur on level after level of that staircase up. So attraction and repulsion, which you saw at work in quarks, as they form neutrons and protons, attraction and repulsion is something that you will find on every single stair step up. It's an pattern. And if you create a successful metaphor that nobody else has ever used before, it's successful. Gesundheit. So it's successful because you have captured one of those patterns that recurs on stair step after stair step after stair step of this climbing universe, which somehow manages to climb by using massive materialism, consumerism, waste, and vain display. All sins? No, those are nature's way of doing things. And if you capture one of those in a simple example, like the hurricane you were talking about before, you will see that pattern on level after level of emergence. That's why your metaphor works. Does that make any sense?
I think that it does. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. Pardon the interruption, but I have to ask you for a favor. If you are listening to this podcast and you are entranced and amazed and hypnotized by the ideas that are being presented, then consider coming over to patreon.com/DemystifySci. For just 75 cents a week, you can help us ensure that this podcast always keeps growing, never sells you garbage, and is always seeking out the best ideas that exist in the universe. So hopefully, I'll see you there at patreon.com/DemystifySci. Entropy does seem to be useful for describing certain systems, but then there's always this question of like, okay, well, how do you deal with life? Because life is a very, very ordered system. And the way that life is thought to not violate the laws of entropy is that it produces a lot of disorder in the form of heat that offsets the amount of order that it produces. But then, if you look at the calculation for that, it's kind of a squidgy back of the envelope calculation, because what they do is they equate the amount of heat energy that you get from the production of ATP by metabolizing glucose, and then make kind of like a statistical mechanics calculation about the amount of order that is increased in the cell, and see if it's actually offsetting it or not. And I'm like, I think that we don't understand what's happening inside of cells to a degree that is astonishing. Like, I think that our understanding of the interior world of life is still in its absolute infancy. Like, the techniques that we use to study life feel like Stone Age techniques. It always comes down to breaking things apart, to making rough calculations of what's happening inside of cells. And so this seems to be like the weakest place when it comes to applying a universal principle of entropy to the entire cosmos.
Well,
Because
that's why we need a first law of flamboyance. That's why we need to reevaluate our staircase. Remember, with entropy, the slinky is going down step by step by step. With the first law of flamboyance, the universe is climbing the staircase step by step by step.
Okay, so this leads very neatly into a subject that you know a lot about, because I'm like, I feel like the music industry between the years of like 1960 and 1990 was in the epitome of, let's say, flamboyance. It was producing just extraordinary music. Like Shiloh and we just got a record player, and we discovered that in our town of 20,000 people, there's actually 3 record stores. And so we've been going.
That's amazing.
It's amazing. And they're cool. Like, they have a ton of stuff in them, and they're super busy every single time we go into them. But I have this weird experience as I'm going through all of this, because I'm thinking about just the sheer number of people that were working on every single one of these records, like the number of studios, the massive engine that was powering that. And it seems like that has fallen off tremendously. Like, the ordered system of the record industry has died out. How does that fit with this principle of flamboyance?
Actually, the industry, yes, as we knew it, had disappeared. First of all, I had a friend, Val Geist, who was one of the world's leading experts on large mammal behavior. And he said some things are luxury functions. What does that mean? In a sexual world, we've lived in a sexual world for approximately 1 to 2 billion years. That's how long sex has been around. Sex is not the shortest distance between 2 points, which is what current views judge by think is basic to the universe. It's the longest possible line between 2 points. And
like, it's a lot easier to just bleb off and make a new version of yourself than it is to, like, go out and find a mate and do the courting ritual.
And yet that's what this universe puts us through, is the long tortured path to finding a mate, the long tortured path to holding on to a relationship, and all the flamboyance that the mating process demands. So music for kids in the late 1960s, up until then, music had been the music of crooners, of singers. And Frank Sinatra appeared at the Paramount Theater in New York City. And it was during the Second World War. Men were off at war. Women were on their own. They were working. And so he packed the theater. And the girls rose to their feet. They screamed, and they even fainted. What Frank Sinatra was doing as a crooner was a luxury movement, a luxury moment. He was demonstrating the surplus in this society in the most flamboyant way he possibly could, with the kind of huge machine you were talking about behind him. Then in 1955, Elvis Presley redefined the role of a singer. It was no longer a crooner. And yet he was still seeking the girls who would stand on their feet, scream, and faint as a demonstration of how successful he was. And he was all about flamboyance to the nth degree, especially after his first 2 years when he became a Las Vegas attraction of all things. And then in 1964, the Beatles redefined things again. Because up until then, singers like Frank Sinatra and like Elvis Presley had sung other people's songs. They had been largely a creation of producers, the guys who find the songs, imagine whole new ways of orchestrating them with all kinds of hooks that you've never heard before, and then just use the singer as another instrument. All of a sudden, the Beatles came along, and they had the audacity to shatter that previous system by writing their own damn songs. But they were still a luxury function. People by the hundreds of thousands gathered, finding a common identity in the Beatles' music. So underlying all of this is this vast luxury function. The peacock is the perfect example of a luxury function. It is extraordinarily expensive for a peacock to make that tail. It means that he's got a giant billboard up for any animal looking for a dinner, saying, "I'm here, eat me." And it's difficult for him to escape from predators. Plus, all the things that we haven't been able to put into words that we've really been talking about this time, how in the world does that tail come about? How in the world does this utter act of flamboyance, consumerism, materialism, and vain display happen? And yet, showing off your surplus is a basic to humans in the mating game. It is a basic to human groups in competing with each other, like the groups that compete in science for different ideas. It is shown off massively when two nations go to war, or whole coalitions go to war. He who can expend the most surplus wins. At the beginning of World War II, or just before World War II, Hitler's generals came to him and they said, "We have only enough material to last 3 years in war." And Hitler, who was accustomed to winning in really short time spans and winning everything he tried, said, "Okay, 3 years is enough. I'll go for it." And America, which got into the war very late, had seemingly infinite resources, tremendous surplus. We were able to produce one giant ship that could carry 1,000 men a day. And the next day produced another one. It was astonishing. We were producing aircraft like that. It was astonishing. So he who had the most surplus won. Hitler did not have enough surplus. It was as simple as that. It was like the competition between two peacocks, showing off those enormous materialist, consumerist, vain displays. So the universe has built us to show off surplus, to gather surplus and show it off, whether we're a peacock or a human being. I mean, dinosaurs used to do this by having enormous plates on their head and these things that looked like tombstones running down their back, and tails with giant balls with which they could smash other dinosaurs. So this display of surplus has been going on for a long time, and it generates creativity. And what is this cosmos all about? It is about finding that next stair step up. And you find that next stair step up by trying out every astonishing, impossible thing that you can. How do you get headlines right now around the world? You do something impossible. If you go to the moon and you're China, that's a big first for the rest of the world. And it's going to hit headlines all over the place. If you go to Mars and you start setting up a settlement like Elon Musk wants to do, that's the impossible. And that's what Elon Musk gets attention for. He has never had a PR department. And look at the press he gets, because he's doing impossible things. He just did with the Starship, flying successfully a few days ago. So nature has apparently generated us to be generators of impossible things. And nature has succeeded by putting us in part through the sexual game, where only the man who is most successful at doing impossible things and most successful at gathering surplus, he gets more of the girls, which means that his genes go on to the next generation. And yes, I'm using the word his because this is a gender specific function. Women tend, on the whole, to look for surplus and be attracted to surplus. Men, on the whole, have to show it off in one form or another. Even me,
it seems like that generates a ton of waste in the process too, right? Like that's a lot of wasted dudes, and like there's a lot of records in these record stores that no one's ever heard of. Like
that's true. And we used to say in 1981, when there was an enormous crash in the record industry, we ship gold and we get back platinum, meaning we've shipped 500,000 records because we thought this was going to be a big hit, but it was a year of radical depression and people weren't buying records. And the stores send us back 1 million copies of what we just sent to them. Yes, enormous surplus all along the way, but it's surplus. It's not waste. It's not entropy. It's transformation, not entropy. You know, any organism like a bacterial colony stretches out looking for new sources of food. And if it finds a new source of food, it settles down. It started out as an explorer mode. It had a tail, it was able to propel itself, it was able to move around. Once it finds food, it settles down. It creates, instead of a tail, it has a stalk. And that stalk glues it to its food source. So it goes through these alternating functions of exploration and settlement. And exploration is a vital part of the process. And what are the three of us? We're all explorers. We are all explorers. We are equivalent to those bacteria off hunting for a new source of food. We are explorers trying to change the way people think, to take it up a notch from where it was, let's say, in 1850, or where it is today.
Well, so to go back to this question of music, I find that listening to older records, like we were just listening to Sting and the Police, Ghost in the Machine. It's a really ornate record. Or
Right.
we were listening to The Best of the Band. Again, a really ornate record that has a lot of detail and instrumentation and harmonies and complexity. And then you listen to modern music and it doesn't seem to have the same sort of complexity in it. And
I ache for that because to tell you the story. So, you know, I've been in science all of my life since that book arrived in my lap when I was 10 years old. And I read a book by the Lomax brothers when I was 12. The Lomax brothers took a tape recorder, a huge tape recorder, an ancient tape recorder, and packed it in the trunk of their car and went down south and started recording every form of music, folk music they could find. And most of that folk music was made by the Black community in the South. The most powerful music was made by the Black community. Again,
there's some really awesome stuff in Appalachia too. Just shout out to my Appalachian people. There's some really dope Appalachian music on those Lomax tapes too.
Right. So they pointed me to something called soul, the ecstatic experience, the transcendent experience. And since science, as I learned it from books, because nobody ever taught me, I was reading 2 books a day. And science is about the aspiration to omniscience. It's about the attempt to comprehend and explain everything. And so the Lomax brothers were putting this material in front of me. They called it soul, the ecstatic experience. I had never been anywhere near that in my life. And it became very important. And at the same time, Isaac Asimov, in his Foundation trilogy, came up with a phrase, mass behavior. So understanding the mass behavior that leads to the ecstatic experience and experiencing the ecstatic experience became important to me. So when I got out of college, undergraduate school, I had 4 fellowships in what is today called neuroscience. I was going to have to paste the program together myself. But one way or the other, I saw graduate school is Auschwitz for the mind. Here I was in pursuit of the ecstatic experience in order to do what science demands, understand everything. And I was not going to get anywhere near the ecstatic experience by giving paper and pencil tests to 22 college students in exchange for psychology credit for the rest of my life. In fact, I was going to be kept away from it. So I did a strange move, and I went into something I knew nothing about. I grew up with Rachmaninoff, Beethoven, Bartok, Stravinsky, people like that. Pop music was the music of the kids who beat me up. And so it was never my culture. But I decided to go into popular culture. And first I established a very successful avant-garde commercial art studio on the East Coast. And then I was tapped to edit, of all things, something I knew nothing about, a rock magazine. And eventually I founded the biggest PR firm in the record industry. And to me, this was the equivalent of what Margaret Mead did with Samoa. She went off as an American woman, immersed in American culture, created and shaped by American culture. She went into the Samoan culture and she did what's called participant observer science. She became Samoan. She thought, felt the way that Samoans do. And she was so successful at this, immersing herself in the Samoan culture, that the Samoans, they crowned her as a chief. No woman was supposed to be a chief, and certainly no foreigner was supposed to be a chief, but this was a testament to how successfully she had immersed herself in that culture and came back to explain it to us. So I saw going into popular culture as a Margaret Mead move, going into a culture that was totally foreign to me and coming to understand it. So I ended up founding the biggest PR firm in the music industry and working with Michael Jackson, Prince, Bob Marley, Bette Midler, AC/DC, Aerosmith, Kiss, Queen, Billy Joel, Billy Idol, Paul Simon, Peter Gabriel, David Byrne, etc. Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, a whole lot of others. And because I was not from the tribe and did not know its ways, I was able to look at each way that was given to me as something you must do and say, is this useful? Will this help me achieve my goals with the people I'm working with Michael Jackson, Prince, etc.? I threw away all the ones that didn't work, and then I started fashioning my own, largely based on the way of thinking that I had been taught by Martin Gardner's Scientific American section called Mathematical Games. And it worked. And it worked in a way that goes back to your question, which is, why was the music so much richer then? Or was it richer then? Well, look, when I went into that culture and became a chief, which is the equivalent of what I became, I had a simple dictum. If you two came into my office and you wanted me to represent you, I said, look, if you expect me to fashion an artificial mask, and we'll call it your image, and sit here as if I were a guy in a plaid suit with a big cigar and say, kid, with this image, I'm going to make you a star, then I will send you to my best competitor immediately, because I don't do that. If you're going to work with me, you have to understand that music is not an exchange of pieces of plastic. It is not an exchange of dollar bills. It is an exchange of human soul. And if I'm going to work with you, I will spend a month studying everything you've ever done. And then I will insist on coming to an environment that is yours, that reflects who you are. And in that environment, I need to spend anywhere from 1 to 3 days with you, with no wives, no intercessors, no managers, no assistants, no nothing. It's just you and me. And here's my job. When you sit down at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in front of a blank piece of paper or a blank computer screen, and you're on deadline for your next album, and you need to write a lyric, you know you cannot write a lyric. You have no idea of how you've ever written a lyric before in your life, but you certainly know you cannot do it today. And on a good day, by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there's a lyric in front of you. Well, that lyric came from the gods inside you. That lyric came from your passion points, from the self deep down below that you only know through its products, and you only know on rare occasion. My job is to find that God inside you. My job is to find that soul inside you. And I will do it. And then I will show you how to show your soul to your fans and your potential fans. So that if we manage to make you so big that kids at the age of 12 are buying posters of you and putting it up on their walls and are using you the way we use a trellis. You know what a trellis is? It's this little framework of wood on which tomato plants grow. So if you're going to be a trellis for these kids, we need to base everything on your soul, period. Because you will be doing a soul transfusion to those kids, and they will grow up on the trellis of you. And if we put anything dishonest in there, we're cursing the kids. We cannot do that. So that was my job. And I brought that. It didn't exist in the record industry. Remember, I'm a science person on a very peculiar quest. And that was the epitome of how things were done for the years that I was in the business, 17 years. And then when I left, that disappeared. And everything became marketing. And what is marketing? Well, we'll take a really astonishing soul deep performer like Ben Harper. We'll get him a Coca-Cola tie-in. Or we'll get him a ginger ale tie-in. Or with Hall & Oates, we'll get him a Chrysler tie-in. That's the death of the fucking artist's ability to communicate who he really is or she who really is to her audience. Never do that. I would not allow that for my clients. One of my clients, when I convinced him not to take $1.5 million from Heinz Ketchup for a ketchup commercial, they had just done Carly Simon's Anticipation. They were trying to turn the curse of ketchup in the days of, you probably remember this, glass bottles. And getting the damn ketchup out of that bottle was impossible. So they did use the Anticipation. Now they wanted to use one of my clients' songs, John Mellencamp, Hurt So Good. And John called and said, what should I do about this? And I said, John, look, what do you want to be doing 15 years from now? Do you want to be clipping coupons on your investments? Or do you want to be making music for your audience? And John said, I want to be making music for my audience. Then I said, you have to turn down that ketchup commercial. And here's why. You imagine Jerusalem in the days of the Bible with high, high city walls. And all of the rich people in Jerusalem are having dinner parties. And you're locked outside the gates. You're out in the wilderness. You are being told, in essence, you are nobody. You have no identity whatsoever. You don't count. And you, John Mellencamp, are out there in that wilderness, raising your fist against the walls of the city and saying, I have a right to be. I have a right to exist. And the transformation we talk about is the transformation that every teenager goes through from the age of 12, being pitched out into the wilderness by their genes. I mean, kids smell bad to their parents when they hit puberty, and their parents smell bad to kids. What is nature telling us? Get the hell out of your home. You must make it on your own. And everybody feels insignificant at the age of 13, out in that wilderness. So I said, John, you are speaking for those kids. You are giving them a right to exist. If you take that ketchup commercial, you'll be one of the people at the dinner parties inside the walls of the city, and you will no longer be able to speak for your audience. So you must turn down that ketchup commercial. And John lost his manager over it. His manager was the manager who also handled Rod Stewart and who had made a lot of money and who had invested in racehorses and was paying almost no attention to the music industry and paying lots of attention to his racehorses, Billy Gabb. He was a high-flying figure. And John lost that manager over this. But who cares? John is still making music for his audience.
This is making me feel a lot better about everything we're doing here at this podcast, because I've kind of seen the same thing happen to the podcast space that happened with the commercialization of music. Like we've kind of sworn off, like we get those catch up commercial people emailing us every day too, for what it's worth, even though we have a relatively small platform here. There's no paucity of people lining up to turn this and every other podcast on earth into, the home shopping network, essentially, right? And everybody's doing it is what's crazy, because when podcasts first started becoming a thing, 15, 20 years ago, maybe really getting mainstream 10 years ago, the whole promise was, look, we're outside of the corporate media. We don't have commercials. Like, we don't have any of this garbage. And like, look at it now. It's just like a sea of gambling advertisements and,
oh God,
alcohol and like nicotine pouches and just garbage. And so I would like to believe, I guess we've just been kind of following our own intuition, that we won't be able to really speak to the people we're trying to speak to if we're concerned with, is this going to play well with, the catch-up sponsorship that we just got? Because
so if I had been your publicist back then, I would have told you, stick to your fucking soul. Period. Be intolerant about it.
We are very intolerant. I was listening to a podcast about the history of the various alphabet agencies getting involved in protest movements and then infiltrating them and destroying them. And literally, it had an ad for a local hardware store, for some reason in Spanish.
Yeah.
It had an ad for nicotine pouches and then for Hendrick's gin that was interspersed repeatedly throughout the half-hour-long podcast. And it's weird because it feels so flimsy and cheap. And something that I've been trying to figure out is why it feels that way. And I wonder if you can tie it to this principle of flamboyance that you have going, where it's like, if the art itself is this trellis, it seems like that is the trellis of flamboyance, where you are creating a framework on which the next generation can project itself and lift itself up towards something because it gets closer to the light and sees something. Okay. What is it about the co-opting of advertisers and this machine that prevents that principle from being able to act?
It's a good question. It's a very solid question, because in theory, the hardware store is offering all kinds of empowerments. It's offering all kinds of things that it allows us to do that we couldn't do without it. And so it should be a positive. The nicotine pouches, I'm sorry, I can't say anything positive about nicotine pouches and alcohol, except my dad owned a liquor store, and that's what sent me to college. So, but I'm totally anti-alcohol. Those are luxury functions. Alcohol, tobacco, stuff like that. But the real stuff that counts, in my opinion, is what you're doing. Because you are trying to punch through the ceiling that leads to the next stair step up. So am I. That's my whole reason. Look, I'm 82 years old. I should be worn out at this point. No, I have 2 books left to do. And this process, this mission that somehow landed literally in my lap when I was 10, is profoundly important. And punching through the ceiling above us to the level above is my job.
But why does shilling stuff prevent that punch from being able to happen?
That's a good question. It is not soul stuff. And nobody speaks to our soul. Some television shows do marginal jobs of it, but in every generation, there is a new generation that has grown up in a radically new environment with radically new tools. Very different from its parents' generation. And every kid feels he or she is crazy at the age of 12 or 13 when they first emerge from the family, because they have feelings that are not expressed anywhere in the culture around them. And then somebody like, let's say, Joan Jett, one of my clients, whose career I architected, for the good, not for the bad. And Joan Jett comes along and says, you are a woman. You feel disenfranchised. You're put in second place. Well, guess what? You have a right to be. Joan, like John Mellencamp, raised her fist That was her classic gesture. That came directly from the deep insides of her. And her gesture was somehow different from John's. John's was at this level. Jones was at this level. And she was saying, you are a woman, you have been disenfranchised to a certain extent, one way or the other. You have power. And that power comes from where it comes from in me, in Joan Jett. It comes from your fucking soul. And you stay true to it for the rest of your life. And it will give you a trellis on which to climb.
What if you just really love ketchup? And you're
What's
like willing.
that?
I said, what if you really love ketchup enough that you're willing to show
If you
it?
really love ketchup, that's great. But once you've aligned yourself with a giant corporation, you're not aligning yourself with individuals trying to establish their identity and their importance in the world. You've left them behind. You've gone inside the walls of the city. And as admirable as the people in the city are, remember, cities produce something like 90% of the wealth in the United States. As admirable as they are, you have to first find yourself. Now, when Joan raises her fist, she doesn't just speak on behalf of one girl. She speaks on behalf of hundreds of millions of girls who need that message that you have a right to be, you have a right to personal empowerment. And
it just sounds like what you're saying is like, if you speak to anything other than what your mandate is, then you're somehow dissipating the energy of that message. Like, and it can get really corrupt. Like, it could be catch up, but like, let's pick on the king for a second, right? Like Joe Rogan. He's like DraftKings sports betting, and then it's like this long ad, and then it's like, if you have a gambling problem, please call 1-800.
yes,
Like,
oh God,
it's clearly like this despicable industry, right?
right?
Joe's not particularly into gambling from anything I know about him, so he's not selling something that he actually cares about. It obviously is bad for people, but it's still funding, you know, his mansion lifestyle or whatever, and so he does it. And so like, that's the extreme version, is you're selling something that's just like utterly garbage and destructive.
Right.
But like, I guess even selling something like ketchup, which seems innocuous, and we can actually have a conversation about whether ketchup is innocuous or not. But if you're selling something even innocuous, you're still dissipating energies away from that lightning rod, which is this deep well of truth inside of yourself. And anything that splits that lightning is going to weaken what you're actually trying to do. And I think that it actually disempowers you as a voice. And that's what's fundamentally corrupting about it, is that you're no longer working only for what drives you. You're now splitting it off. Like, it's just kind of weak. It's diluted in this weird way.
And the love song of Jail for Proof by T.S. Eliot, which I used to recite out loud at a jazz club in Buffalo, New York, when I was 16 years old, at the top of my lungs, basically says you have a limited amount of life force. And if you have something heroic to do that you think will define you, that you think will bring the maidens of the sea coming to kiss your feet, you must start it now. Not tomorrow, now. Why? Because if you don't start it now, you will put it off until tomorrow, then you will put it off until next week, then you will put it off until next year. And one day you will wake up and realize that your life force is gone. The power with which you could have done those things is gone, and you will never be that person that you feel defines you. And there's another factor here, and it goes back to animal behavior. In a bee colony, there are two kinds of bees. There are worker bees, and there are searcher bees. The worker bees go out every day and follow each other to the flower patch of the day. And they leave a trail of pheromones saying, this is it. This is the hot property. This is your job. It's like having a job at General Motors. And when they come back, there's a landing dock inside the hive. And there are unloader bees. And the unloader bees, if you're bringing in something that's vital to the hive, like water when the hive is running out of water, or nectar when the hive doesn't have enough nectar, those loader bees will come over to you and gather around you and feel you all over with their antennae and treat you like a superstar. And they will unload the nectar you are carrying in what's called your public stomach. and they will unload all of the pollen on the carrying hairs on your back legs, and you'll feel super. And you'll go out all excited back to that flower patch again. Well, there's a bunch of lazy, godforsaken bees in the colony. They're bohemian bees. They're hippie bees. I mean, what do? When everybody else is going off to work, they are going off following their curiosities. And they will do 8 miles of loops, just doing nothing, following their whatever, all day. Well, out of that 200 explorer bees, 5 will find what they think are the next flower patch. And they will come back to the hive and they will dance. And they will dance instructions on how to get to that flower patch, and they will dance their level of excitement. And now, meanwhile, eventually the hot flower patch of the day runs out, and all the worker bees are coming back with almost nothing or nothing. And the explorer bees are taking one look at them. The unloader bees are taking one look at them and turning their backs in a way that, if it were humans, would kill us. And in fact, the bees try this over and over and over again until they get the message. We're not interested in you. You have nothing to offer us. And then they will start crawling. Normally bees walk with straight legs. No, they will start crawling. They will crawl into the hive, and they will be what Thomas Seeley, the greatest researcher on this, calls unemployed bees. And they will be in a state of bee depression. How can you tell? Their body temperature goes down. And what do they do to get their energy back? Well, there's this commotion going on the unloading dock from these 5 bees who have found what they think are hot new flower patches. So you will go check out the entertainment to rouse your spirits again. And if one bee manages to dance for 27 minutes straight and the other bees only dance for 5, that one bee that has the most enthusiasm, and this is a luxury function, showing all of this stuff, and it's information. And that, if that bee rouses you, gets you out of your torpor, out of your misery, out of your depression, you will go check up on her instructions to see what the patch she's talking about is like. And if it seems rich to you, you will come back and become a backup dancer for that explorer bee. And the bee who gets the most backup dancers wins in the breakdance contest. And all the conformist bees go flying out to the hot new flower patch of the day. Well, when you are an adolescent, you're at a choice point. Are you going to become an explorer bee, or are you going to become a conformist bee, a worker bee? And some of us can't live without being explorer bees. We simply can't live without being explorer bees. And what are we doing? We're looking for the hot new flower patch of ideas. If necessary, we construct a hot new flower patch of ideas and bring it back to the unloading dock. And in my case, because my obligation is to speak to that kid 350 years down the line and tell him he's worthwhile, or tell her, you are worthwhile. You have a mission in life. Here is your mission. If I can do that, then that's my audience. It's not just the unloader bees on the platform today. It's the unloader bees 100, 350 years from now that I'm performing for. And, that's my life. Am I betting on something utterly false? Will I be forgotten when I die? Well, the odds are yes. But remember, in this universe, it's not the most probable thing that happens. Probability theory doesn't cut it for this universe. It's the most improbable thing that happens. And the 3 of us are all going after the most improbable things and trying to stay true to that soul within us that John Mellencamp had to stay true to, that Prince had to stay true to, in order to become trellises on which future generations could grow. And what happened in the business is that I left it in 1988. No one else was preaching what I was preaching. Sounds strange for a science person, but yes, I was preaching something. And it all went back to marketing. And with a marketing focus, nobody paid attention to the soul anymore. And the soul in the music, as I see it, and maybe it's just because I'm old and I don't relate to the music now, but kids do. But the music has lost that soul. It has lost that authenticity, in my opinion. And remember, I'm an egomaniac when I'm thinking about this issue. So
I
I
think
could
it's
be
still
totally
out
wrong.
there. It's just you're not going to hear about it because it's, if you don't buy into the superpower structures that are going to elevate you to attention, then you're doing like just doing a dance off in the corner of the hive and nobody's noticing. I
And
just
that can
don't think
happen.
that independent artists, independent podcasts, people who aren't buying into the marketing scheme, they haven't figured out a way to build as big of a microphone as the marketing scheme people have.
Right.
And so people just don't know about them. Like I know a few fantastic artists that no one will ever hear. And honestly, if you like sift through the record store, you'll find them from times past too.
Right.
But the question becomes like how do you get that through as an independent artist who's not buying into the marketing scheme?
Well,
Like
what
what
I did, uh, you know, everything you step into is a challenge. These are realities. It's your job to understand them. That's what your obligation is as a scientist. So that's how I stepped into the music industry, something I knew nothing about, not a thing. And when I was made an editor of a magazine, my job was to reach as many readers as I possibly could. So I studied my readers carefully, and I did mathematical calculations too, primitive ones, correlational studies. And I found that artists that were touring would vastly outsell artists that didn't tour. An artist could have a hit and still become a two-hit wonder and disappear. But if you were touring on a regular basis, then you were building a relationship with your audience, and that audience would sustain you. So if you had a hit, it was a vastly different proposition from the two-hit wonders. So I learned touring strategy.
How do you make sense of something like Steely Dan then? Didn't they famously not ever tour?
Well, I just got a note from Gary Katz yesterday, who was their producer, saying he was very proud of what I've done in my life so far, because it's been a long time since we actually talked on the phone. But Steely Dan, I never understood Steely Dan.
An
I mean,
anomaly.
presumably they're just a hit factory. Like if you have enough hits, like they weren't a band that had one or two good songs on every record. Like every song was a hit, and it was kind of designed, I think, to just overpower by the law of large numbers. But half the
They
guys left
did
that band
they
to go
did the
form.
most improbable thing, and a
Hmm.
small number of us, many of us are explorers. Many of us will die exploring, just like the bacteria that have the tails and travel, and they travel in groups of 10,000. It's not like a lone bacteria. So, in terms of that group of 10,000, look, you you leave your family basically in spirit. You don't know who you are. You are confused, think that your experiences are experiences you can never express to anybody because nobody else ever has them. And then Joan Jett comes along and validates your experience. What does she do? She welds you together as a subculture. And she gives your subculture voice. She is the tongue, the speaking apparatus for that subculture, even if the way she speaks is all in the movements of her body when she's on stage. And so life forms, on the whole, do not do things as individuals. They do things as groups. And when you and I express our opinions, if they're off center, we have to see if we are the tongue of a subculture just aching to be. In 1995, when my first book came out, The Lucifer Principle, I was very disturbed because in evolutionary sciences, there was individual selectionism and group selectionism. And group selectionism, meaning a competition between groups, actually influences evolution, was laughed at. It was loathed. It was despised. It was said to be totally false. just nonsensically false. And if you showed any interest in it, if you showed serious interest in it, you would be thrown off your track toward a full professorship. In other words, you would cease to be published in the leading publications. You would be so. I said, "Fuck that." I'm not from your tribe, and to develop my way of thought, I have to be able to accept individual selection and group selection simultaneously. That means group selection has to be honored. It has to be given voice. And so I went on a 1-year campaign. I'd only been out of the music industry for 7 years. I was sick. I was in a bed. I was in a bed for 15 years. I had been unable to speak for 5 years and too weak to speak. And I'd been unable to have another person in the room with me. But I was just coming out to the point where I could speak again.
Wait, what
And
happened to you?
it's called chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis. But I had it so early that nobody knew. My doctor had no idea of what was going on with me. And I finally said, look, I apparently have chronic fatigue syndrome. And 3 years later, he called me and he said, thank you for educating me about chronic fatigue syndrome. I'm now seeing it in a lot of my patients. But there was no name. Myalgic encephalomyelitis as a term had not come along. And I had it. It was very serious. I didn't know whether I was dying or what. So I had a meeting with my staff and I said, I don't know what's going on with me. I could be dying, but one way or the other, I have to be out of this office in 2 weeks and I'm giving you the business. And the next day I got a call from California, from another person who ran a PR agency offering me a lot of money for my PR firm. And I said, look, I can't sell it to you. I just gave it to my staff. And I left. But remember why I got into this. This was my Margaret Mead expedition to Samoa. And by 1986 and 1987, I felt I had answered all of my questions and I belonged back in my science. And I started writing the Lucifer Principle. I would sneak into the office early in the morning and spend an hour working on it and then do my work. And when I was called by U2, I really didn't like their music. And I didn't want to do this again. I had done it for a bunch of people and it wasn't interesting anymore. There were no new lessons.
Why didn't you like U2's music?
What's that?
Why didn't you like U2?
I have no idea.
It just didn't speak to you.
Yeah, it just didn't speak to me at all. And I was asked by Mick Jagger's assistant to work with him, and I didn't want to work with handling the whims of a foil rock star. Diana Ross had tried that with me, and 4 days into working for her, I quit. I resigned. She was abusive. And that wasn't what I was in this for. So I was running out of questions and filled with answers. But if you're a legend in your business, and I was, your wife's never going to let you out of that job because it means money. However, I got sick. And there was nothing anybody could do about it, including me. And it's not happy getting sick. It's appalling. It's absolutely appalling to have no idea of what's wrong with you and have weird symptoms. And but after 3 years of fighting the illness, I realized, okay, I have a limited amount of energy. It's like pennies in a piggy bank. I have to decide how I'm going to spend it. And every day I got up and went to my front room where my office was and sat down in the office chair I loved and tried to work. And that wasn't working. And I got an assistant to set up 2 computers operated from 1 monitor and 1 keyboard next to the bed. And I started working from bed. And that's when my voice started to return. Apparently, with chronic fatigue syndrome, I had a choice. You either sit up, or you give up on sitting up and you can speak. If you sit up, you can't. So one way or the other, I got, there was the leading proponent of what he called multi-level selection. In other words, both group selection and individual selection. And he told me I founded something called the Group Selection Squad. And all kinds of scientists from literally all over the world came and joined this group because they had no voice. The same way that the girls who went to Joan Jett concerts had no voice. And I became the voice for this movement toward the acceptance of group selection. And I got these emails, all in caps, like the president uses now, shouting at me, saying, Howard, you have to stop this immediately. I put my whole life into this and you're going to destroy it. Who ever heard of a group selection squad? Sounds like men in tights. And we finally got on the phone together and he told me to stop it. And I said, no, I'm not going to stop it. And a year later, I had him on the cover of the Tuesday science section of the New York Times in a 6-column piece. And that's what validated group selection. Despite all my work with Nature magazine and Science magazine and the key journals, it was a New York Times story that changed things utterly. So I became the voice.
Was this at the center of the Lucifer Principle?
What's that?
What was the Lucifer Principle? Was it about this?
No, the Lucifer Principle, a scientific expedition into the forces of history, is about what you might call group dynamics. It's about why groups go to war. I was inspired to do this. Peter Gabriel walked into my office one day, and I loved him. He was tech-minded up in amazing ways. He was not like other thinkers in music. And Peter said, there's this idea you should check out. It's right up your alley. And it's called the Gaia effect. So I went out and looked it up. We didn't have laptops in those days, and found it. I found an article by Lynn Margulis, one of the most famed biologists of the 20th century, and her son, Dorian Sagan, the son of Carl Sagan. And it seemed to glory in the great die-off of the oxygen catastrophe a few billion years ago, when the bacteria, once they invented photosynthesis, once they invented snagging photons and turning photons into real tangible stuff, they started emitting a poisonous gas. But if bacteria are emitting a poisonous gas, farting out a poisonous gas, what difference does it make? This atmosphere is enormous. Bacteria are so small we can't even see them. A bacterial colony is so thin we can't see it. It could be right on your hand and you wouldn't even know it. So what's a little fart from creatures like this? But after 2 billion years of farting, the farts became a very powerful element in the atmosphere, but they were poisonous. That's why you fart things out, because those things are noxious to you. They're poisonous to you. And eventually they poisoned the atmosphere. This was the greatest incident of atmospheric pollution that this planet has ever seen. And so creature after creature, colony after colony were dying off. But there were these tiny little bacteria that took this poison and used it as an energy source. So bigger bacteria, this is Lynn Margulis's idea, which is now mainstream, it's accepted. So the big bacteria said basically in biological terms to the little bacteria, okay, I'm going to give you a paradise. I will produce the ideal environment for you. I will give you exactly what you love to eat the most. All you have to do is do it inside my cell walls, inside my membrane, inside of me. And the deal worked out because the poison, those tiny little bacteria we're using as an energy source, is called oxygen. That was the toxic pollutant of the atmosphere at the time. And in the article, Lynn Margulis, she later became a friend, and Dorian Sagan, who also later became a friend, were glorying over this. And I saw it as a mass die-off. I saw it as a catastrophe. I saw it as something no human can ever accept. You cannot accept mass murder, period, or you're a part of it. So I said, okay, then I got to write a book called The Lucifer Principle. And it's a book not glorying in this kind of thing. It's a book exploring this kind of thing up the kazoo. Every kind of instance of it in nature we can find, including human war and human hatreds. And I will cover those. So that's what I did. I set out to cover these things. And it has a radically new way of looking at these things, a radically new set of principles. And it turns out that once the book came out, it was almost impossible to find a publisher. I mean, look, what am I? Am I a music publicist? What am I if I'm a music publicist? And that's all I am. How dare I write a book like this? But I finally found a publisher. And 4 years after the book was completed, it was published. And then I started getting letters from kids. And the letters from kids, usually 16 or 17-year-olds, would say, "Thank you for writing that book. I was lost and you saved me." Now, does that have anything to do with my ultimate goals in life? You sure bet. You bet your ass. So it's a book of looking at mass human behavior and mass human emotion through the lens of science and seeing the underlying patterns in it so that we can proceed from there. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, why do you call it the Lucifer Principle?
Because it was the opposite of the Gaia effect. Lynn Margulis had done the Gaia effect.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
But you mean Lucifer as do you mean Lucifer as this mythological light-bringing force, or this like fallen angel force? Like,
I
which
mean, as
Lucifer?
the source of evil in the universe.
I see.
I mean, look at nature. It kills us all off. Look at nature. It builds us with a program that builds us from a small number of cells up to what we are today. And then it starts taking us apart. Aging is built into us by nature. How dare she? How dare she get away with that shit?
Sounds a lot like entropy.
Well, but it's not. It's a pre-programmed pattern that nature uses for something. Probably because her end goal is innovation. Her end goal is reinventing herself. And if she creates us the way that we are, with puberty and adulthood and middle age and old age, she gets the most out of us. And then she can afford to discard us because life is cheap for nature. This incredibly complex thing, so complex that the three of us do not understand it, although we are doing our best to understand it. And we are standing on the shoulders of giants, meaning generations have been doing their best to understand it and have given us the vocabulary with which we think and speak. Despite all of that, we don't understand death. We don't really understand why nature would devise a system that includes death and pain when we believe that materialism, consumerism, waste, and vain display are all sins. Well, nature is sinning on a scale that's unbelievable. Why does she use these sins? I mean, not that any of them are really sins. The one that is a sin, the two that are a sin, are pain and death. And I will never forgive her for that. I will never forgive God for that. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in a God. I will never forgive nature for that. And we somehow have to find our way beyond these things that is just as creative, if not more creative.
That is very Luciferian, actually. I could see that. Because
Yeah.
I mean, the Miltonian Lucifer is trying to sort of.
He's an
move
organizer.
past
He's the
God.
greatest organizer on the planet. Lucifer.
But I guess the opposite would be that there's some faith that even despite all this death and pain, that it's ultimately building towards something meaningful in the process. Like, there's no better way to do it than with the sea of generations across time.
Apparently,
and that by
that's
dying,
true.
we make way for newer organisms and new
Well,
life
judging
forms.
from the longevity of this pattern of aging and death and pain, everything you just said is true. Nature is using us in order to constantly add new capabilities to herself, and find the next stair step up on that stair step of flamboyance, the first law of flamboyance. But I don't find it morally acceptable. What was that?
Can you define flamboyance?
Little Richard?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, if the complexity is a mechanical term.
Mm.
And and nature is not mechanical. Nature is something else. You can call it organic. You can call it whatever you want. I choose to call it flamboyant. Why? Because it comes up with uses of surplus in ways that are utterly beyond belief. Why did my client, Michael Jackson, get so much attention? In part because he did something impossible. He walked backwards while looking like he was walking forwards. The moon dance. When you do something impossible, you break the bounds of the envelope of possibility for all of mankind. You break the bounds for the universe. This is the first time the universe has ever done this. And now the universe has the moonwalk, a new tool in its toolkit. And that's what we're here under the current system of life and death and aging. That's what we're here to do, to add to the toolkit, not just of humankind, but the toolkit of the cosmos. By doing things this cosmos has never, ever seen before. That is her mandate.
And so do you think that it's possible? Like Shiloh said something really interesting, which is that because this teeming sea of death and pain has been the way that it has worked for eons, millennia. It has always worked that way. You think that there's a way to transcend that in order to. Do you think that that's like the ultimate impossible thing that we're pointing to?
Well, in my book, Global Brain, um, I try to explain to you that humans dream of peace. Humans dream of justice and peace
Some
and
do.
of the kind of pleasures of a heaven. Those dreams are in us universally, so far as I can see. They are universal. And they don't come from us, they come from our nature, if you
Well,
want to call it that.
so
There's
this
some
is
bad guys out there. I may have met two this morning at the grocery store, for instance.
yeah. We went to.
Well, there are bad guys out there, and I've met some of them. But one way or the other, the fact is we dream of these things, and anything we dream and anything we conceive and dream we can achieve. That's the old expression, and it is apparently true. I mean, even if it takes millions of us or billions of us, we eventually accomplish these impossible dreams. And where do we get these impossible dreams of justice and peace and ultimate fructifying? We get them from nature. What is nature trying to accomplish? The next stair step up, to add to its toolkit, to expand the boundary of possibility.
So
That's what we're about.
do you think that your body of work is aiming to make that next step more legible?
Yes.
And
I'm
so what do
taking
you
a very
see?
clumsy tool that we've invented, and it's called language. And I'm trying to use language to get these things across. So when you ask, what is flamboyance? That's challenging my the tools of language available to me. And I'm aching toward new tools and new language. And if kids can pick up that ache and go further than I can in this lifetime with it, maybe we'll expand our vocabulary a bit.
So what do you think is the most legible way that you can describe the next step that you're trying to get people to see?
Well, for one thing, most of this conversation has taken place in terms of entropy. And I'm trying to get you not to think of things in terms of the waste they create, but to think of things in terms of the functional form they create, the working, dynamic, constantly changing form that is you or me. We are at different points in our lives. You know, you're in early adulthood, and I'm in old age. But I'm walking 8 miles a day, and I'm doing it to fling a finger in the face of time, a finger in the face of mortality.
You are livelier than most people I come across at any age.
And that's despite the fact that my air conditioner is not on and I function best at 66 degrees. So that's
We'll
a
get you back
miracle.
to it shortly.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess the point that I see you trying to make is that there's a feeling of darkness and hopelessness that has taken us over, which is that we spend all of our time focusing on the waste products of humanity. There is this tendency to look at the output of all human efforts as being just about waste, just about the
Right.
fact that we are consuming so much, and in the process of consuming, we're destroying. And we seem to have lost sight of this thing that is one step before the waste, which is, well, if we're making something that is useful and good and flamboyant and reaching to this next step, then the waste is part of some kind of function. And so are you aiming to try to get people to like shift their perspective from just being obsessed with this, like the darkness of the waste, and to be more obsessed with the question of like, well, what are we actually going to do? Like, what is the point of life? What
What's
is
the
the point of
paradise? What's
this?
the possibility of paradise that's implicit in you and me?
Mm.
And how do we turn that from a fantasy into a reality? Yes, I'm trying to do that because remember the story of the Entropists starting in 1850. Well, in 1920, they caught a break. There was a guy who was formulating a bunch of ideas in a new field that didn't have a name yet, which would be called environmentalism. And he grabbed entropy and he made it the basis for his environmental philosophy. Now, entropy is a theory of decay and death. It is a theory that predicts apocalypse. And I'm aiming for the opposite. Look, we can dream of paradises, and for many of us, or most of us, it's an idle dream. But if there are paradises within us, we must do our best to turn them into realities. And to do that, we have to see not the entropy that a plant is producing as it grows, but the miracle of its growth. And no miracle is immune to science. Material miracles are there so science can come to understand them. And yes, I am preaching a universe in which things become progressively better, and in which your job and mine is to be a part of making things better, including some of the mandates of environmentalism. But right now, we are being taught environmentalism as an apocalyptic science.
Mm.
And so we are raising kids who are doomed to depression by the philosophy we embrace. I am saying get the fuck out of that philosophy. That is poison. That's what's killing you, the philosophy. And see that this is a universe on that stair step, going up toward the light constantly, and that you and I are a part of it, even when we try to control the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the new book, The Case of the Sexual Cosmos, everything you everything you know about nature is wrong. That book is there to deliver this message, but it shows you the evolution of life from the point of view of life as being the ultimate rebel, like Joan Jett, like John Mellencamp, not just raising its fist, raising whole new forms and structures, whole new ways of being, constantly, with us or without us. So we're part of a generative process, not an apocalyptic process, a process that's taking us toward the paradises that we dreamed. When in the 1950s, no one could have dreamed of what we have with cell phones and laptops. Nobody could have dreamed of that. And yet we have it, because those of us who are born, who grow, who decay and die, who go through old age and death, people like Steve Jobs have progressively worked step by step by step to carve out entire new paths for humanity. And any new path for humanity is a new path for nature itself and for the cosmos. And that's our job.
Right on.
I love
I
that.
wonder, like, maybe to close this down, if you could speculate on why apocalypticism has been so freaking popular,
It
especially.
is always very popular. Once upon a time, I mean, in science, if your predictions prove wrong, your theory goes out the window.
Sometimes.
And we replace it with another theory.
Might take a while.
But in real life, humans don't work that way. So once upon a time, there was this guy who predicted that if he went up to a certain city for a religious ceremony that was supposed to usher in the savior, that he would go up there, he would have dinner there in the sacred spot, and the savior would come. And he predicted that the kingdom of God was about to descend upon us. And his prediction proved dramatically wrong. Instead, he was betrayed, he was crucified by the Romans, and his followers were left with this big problem. He'd made a prediction. The prediction hadn't come true. So they wiggled it and wobbled it and managed to change the prediction so that his coming would be thousands of years from now. At first, they thought he'd come next week. They literally did. Put yourself in their position. This was the most vivid person in your life. He claimed to be in touch with God, and he'd just been crucified. You've got to believe that his prediction is about to come true any minute now. So first it was next week, then it was next year, then it was the next century, and then it was the next millennium that he would arrive. This entire belief system was built on a false prediction. And yet it is the most popular belief system in the religious world on earth today. It's called Christianity. And the guy who made the prediction that when he went up to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, and where you always leave an empty cup for Elijah, who's the prophet you hope will come to predict or to tell you that the Savior is about to arrive, and he predicted that Savior was finally going to arrive, that was Yeshua of Nazareth. That was Jesus Christ. The Christ name would come later, when St. Paul, Paul of Tarsus, who was also a nice Jewish boy, but Jesus had been a country boy, a redneck, from Nazareth, the son of a woodworker. And this guy, Paul of Tarsus, he was sharp. He was from the big city. He was from a major city, a trading city, whose goods spanned the entire world from Asia to Europe. And so he was sophisticated. He knew the ideas of many, many different philosophies that were coursing through his hometown. His dad was actually a Roman citizen, which was not easy for Jews back then. So he took Jesus and invented a whole new religion around him, that through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, you could be saved. This is a whole new idea.
Well, there's a lot of competing versions of that. I mean, my God.
What's that?
There was a lot of competing versions of Christianity, like the Gnostic sects. And I mean, there was like hundreds of versions of this. Ones that had Christ having a female consort as a partner. Like there was versions where John the Baptist was the central Messiah. Like there was all of these different ones. And it's a really complicated mystery novel as to how the Roman Empire ends up adopting this one version of it as their central state religion eventually, 400 years later.
The very thing the prolificity, if you want to call it that, the prolificness,
virality,
of this idea that had been based on a failed prediction. That's why we differentiate between science and religion. Science throws out failed predictions and moves on from there, though it hasn't in the case of entropy.
I'm surprised you consider yourself an atheist after you just got done making this beautiful picture of nature as this female creature who's got all of these intentions up her sleeve and all of this. It seemed very much like you believed in this creator deity, actually.
Well, I don't know why, but I can't help it. I'm overcome by the spirit, if you want to call it that, and I preach. And I'm immersed in science every waking day of my life. And these things come from my science. And we all do certain things that we can't explain, but if we are open to them, they take us over. And certainly that's what music was all about. That's what that business of sitting in front of a blank piece of paper, knowing you can't write a lyric, and finding a lyric in front of you 2 hours later, That's what this business of going on stage, feeling the eyes of the audience on you, and suddenly having an out-of-body experience and thinking you're watching this from the ceiling and watching as a force that isn't you, dances you like a marionette, like a puppet on stage. My life has been seeking these ecstatic things to bring them into science. When I was a little kid, the group on my block, when I was 5, would all go down to the corner store and they would buy baseball cards. And I would buy cards from this guy who had gone on safaris in Africa, and instead of the usual bring back dead animals, his slogan was bring them back alive. His name was Frank Buck. And that has been ingrained in me since I was 5 years old. And when I went into the music industry, what was my goal? Not to kill it and pickle it and put it in a museum. It was to bring it back alive and find out all you could from that experience. I know this doesn't sound like the average scientist's life course, but who the fuck cares?
I just think that it's so illustrative of something really deep, which is that science can tell you some mechanistic picture of the world, and it can tell you how pieces fit together. But in order to take those pieces and then assemble a vision of where you should go, like what now, you have to have something that's larger, something that is cosmic, something that is this progressive sense of we are moving towards something rather than just being lost in this valueless, random, chaotic universe where nothing matters. Like you have to
Well,
have this
which
point.
you hear in that soul. It's in that word soul too, right?
right.
It's in everyone. Like what would you call it?
Impulse.
That compass, right? It's in there, right? That direction finding entity, whatever it is, that organ. I don't know. I'm just trying to scientize it, but there's something there.
And I think that
Well,
it's a
I
really
agree with what you've said totally. And my new book, The Case of the Sexual Cosmos, Everything You Know About Nature is Wrong, turns the nature of entropy on its head and shows you that life is persnickety, that life has moxie, that life is constantly defying its environment, that life is constantly expanding the bounds of possibility, constantly, and that's our job. And that's the attitude in this book. So I have a couple of friends, and this surprised me. So I wrote the book to the best of my abilities. It took me 14 years. And then put it out there. And people of importance got back to me and said, when I'm feeling down about something, I pick up your book and I read a paragraph and it lifts me again. So science is built on attitude. And the attitude of being objective is important, but it's a tool. And it's not the only tool, because we have powers within us. And the idea is we have to awaken them. We have to understand the importance of what we're doing. We are punching our way toward that next stair step for the cosmos. The work we're doing is not just for you and me. It's for our fellow human beings. It's to give other people trellises on which to grow. It's to give other people a sense of meaning in their lives and purpose in their lives. But most important, it's to grow nature and it's to grow the cosmos itself.
I love it.
I do too.
I think that's a good place to rest for the day, Howard.
Well, we've only done 2 hours and 48 minutes.
Well, I think folks are going to have to pick up the books if they want to learn more about that.
Right. Well, this has been a pleasure. You guys are so good at summing up these ideas that it's absolutely, I've never had a conversation like this in my life.
Whoa.
That's cool. Yeah, I feel like we got off to a rough start there, with our Big Bang heresy and everything. But
right.
I feel like this is it all really comes together in the story. I love that you've had two completely different experiences in this, and so have we very much, right? In terms of coming at nature both from art and coming at it from mechanistic science, right? They give you two different lenses, but I think that if you look back, a lot of the great minds throughout history have approached it from these two angles, actually.
Look at Galileo. His dad was a music theorist,
Literally everyone, like, who's ever
Yeah.
done anything approaches this, honestly, and I feel confident in saying that. Like, all of the greats that you could name have two different lenses they approach things from. They might be more known for one or the other, but you have to take as many perspectives in as possible in order to actually see what's happening here. And I love that you see it as this ascension and that we're part of a bigger project and that it comes from deep inside of us and we have to listen to it and not get distracted by these things that'll tear us off the path. And I think that's really some of the best advice you can give yourself at the end of the day too, when it comes to like slogging through and trying to make it in this world where it's actually pretty difficult to get by. But your life seems to tell the story of someone who sticks to that inner voice and listens to it, and it works out in the end. That's what's really cool about your story, right? These artists that you coached into their massive fame, you didn't coach them there by turning them into something other than what they were. You got them to focus on that inner soul, that inner voice, and channel that and actually obsess over that and not any of the noise that was happening around them. And I think that that's something everybody can take to the bank immediately. So I thank you for putting those into words, and honestly, it seems like a great service and something we can all aspire to.
Well, hopefully we'll do this again on another topic, because there are many topics in
I
my
hope so.
body of work.
What are the next? You said you had 2 more books in you.
Yeah, I've got the current book, The Case of the Sexual Cosmos. So I have to get that to be known. And then I have to write the grand unified theory of everything in the universe, including sex, violence, and the human soul.
All right.
So, in other words, trying to show you how all of these books fit together, how all of these ideas fit together, and how all of these ideas come down to some simple principles, but they also come down to the fact that we should not be focused reductively just on the simple basics, that we have to look at the magnificence of what's come so far and realize this universe ain't through by any stretch of the imagination, hasn't reached its goals by any stretch of the imagination, has not reached the top of the staircase by any stretch of the imagination, and the universe's most important tools for reaching the next stair step up and ultimately reaching the top level are us. Literally, the 3 of us are nature's fingers poking through the envelope of possibility to open it up and reach the next stair step up.
I love that.
I hope there's no top of the staircase.
Yeah.
I hope there's always just more and more cool floors to explore.
But hey, when you
Hopefully.
start working on the next book, just send us a note and we can, as you're starting to put the ideas together, we can throw some things back and forth.
Oh, that would be terrific. That would be wonderful. That probably won't happen for another 6 to 8 months. Probably 2026.
We'll be hard at work in the meantime.
Yeah.
But I have to get faster with this process because I'm 82 and the deadline of death is there and it's real. No
My
matter
grandpa's what, like 100, I think he's 99.
Yep.
Yeah, grandpa's 99. He's bored out of his mind. So be thankful that you have something to work on, I suppose.
Well,
There's,
I'll do
plenty
my
of time,
best to reach that age or beyond if I can. We shall see.
You seem like you're on a good track.
Well, hopefully. So I'll see you again
Yes.
soon on another topic. Let me know when you want me because this is sheer heaven.
All right,
really
let's stay in
enjoyed it.
touch, Howard.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Have a great night.
Yeah, you too.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, folks.